She stood at the gate, a little unsure, her boarding pass trembling slightly in her hand. Worn shoes, a plain sari, and eyes that held stories no one bothered to ask about. The first-class queue wasn't made for women like her, or so people thought. The attendant gave her a quick glance, then a curt shake of the head. "This line is for first-class passengers only," she said firmly. Murmurs began around her. Someone chuckled. Someone rolled their eyes. Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't move. Not yet. Before she could utter a word, the cockpit door clicked open. Out stepped the pilot, tall and poised. His eyes scanned the crowd, then lit up the moment they met hers. Without hesitation, he walked straight toward her. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you may not remember me, but years ago, you saved my life." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The same people who had dismissed her just moments ago were now watching in stunned silence as the pilot took her weathered hand with both of his, reverently. "Please," he added, "seat 1A is waiting." That day, she didn't just walk into first class, she walked into the hearts of everyone who witnessed what true honor looks like. Because respect isn't stitched into uniforms or printed on tickets. It's earned through kindness, remembered through time, and sometimes, it finds its way back at 35,000 feet in the sky. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Flight 447 from Chicago to New York represented the pinnacle of luxury air travel. Its first-class cabin designed to cater to passengers whose wealth and status demanded an experience that justified ticket prices exceeding most people's monthly salaries. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of engineering and comfort, equipped with seats that transformed into fully flat beds, personal entertainment systems with screens larger than most home televisions, and a level of service that made passengers feel more like guests at an exclusive resort than travelers on a commercial flight. The first-class passengers boarding that Tuesday morning represented a cross-section of American elite, hedge fund managers whose decisions moved billions of dollars, entertainment executives whose projects shaped global culture, technology innovators whose products defined how the world communicated, and political figures whose influence extended across multiple branches of government. These were people accustomed to being recognized, accommodated, and deferred to wherever they went. Marcus Wellington, a pharmaceutical CEO whose company's drugs saved millions of lives while generating billions in revenue, settled into seat 2A with the practiced ease of someone who flew first class multiple times per week. His assistant had ensured that his preferences were communicated to the airline, specific newspapers, preferred beverages, and meal requirements that would make the 3-hour flight as productive and comfortable as possible. Beside him, Senator Patricia Hayes reviewed briefing documents for committee hearings that would determine healthcare policy affecting millions of Americans. Her presence on the flight had required coordination with security services, though such arrangements were routine for someone whose legislative work influenced international relations and domestic priorities. The atmosphere in first class was one of quiet efficiency and sophisticated comfort. Flight attendants moved with ballet-like precision, anticipating needs before they were expressed and ensuring that every detail contributed to an experience worthy of passengers who paid premium prices for premium service. Conversations were conducted in hushed tones appropriate to an environment where privacy and discretion were as valuable as luxury and comfort. Jessica Chen, the senior flight attendant, supervised the pre-flight service with the attention to detail that had made her legendary among frequent first-class travelers. She knew the preferences of regular passengers by heart, understood the unspoken protocols that governed interactions between staff and high-profile clients, and maintained standards that reflected the airline's reputation for excellence. The boarding process proceeded with clockwork precision, each passenger greeted personally and escorted to seats that had been prepared according to individual preferences documented in detailed customer profiles. Everything was designed to reinforce the passenger's sense of their own importance while ensuring that their travel experience exceeded expectations that had been shaped by years of luxury service. As the final passengers settled into their seats and the cabin crew prepared for departure, the atmosphere was one of comfortable anticipation. These were people whose time was valuable beyond measure, whose presence on this flight represented a brief intersection of important lives moving towards significant destinations and crucial meetings. What none of them knew, what their careful security screening and exclusive booking procedures had failed to reveal, was that their flight was about to be disrupted by someone whose presence would challenge their assumptions about worth, recognition, and the true meaning of heroism. Dr. Sarah Martinez approached the gate with visible nervousness, clutching a boarding pass that seemed almost too good to be true. At 55, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent decades serving others while remaining largely invisible to the world beyond her immediate community. Her clothes were clean and pressed, but clearly chosen for durability rather than fashion, marking her as someone whose priorities didn't include impressing strangers with displays of wealth or status. She had never flown first class before, had never expected to occupy the same space as people whose names appeared regularly in financial magazines and society pages. The ticket had been a gift from her daughter, a celebration of Sarah's recent retirement from 30 years of service as an emergency room physician at Chicago General Hospital, one of the city's busiest trauma centers. Sarah's career had been defined not by the wealth or recognition that drew media attention, but by her dedication to treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, their social status, or the circumstances that brought them to her emergency room. She had worked night shifts and double shifts, holiday weekends and disaster responses, earning a reputation among her colleagues as someone who never gave up on a patient and never failed to provide the best possible care under any circumstances. Her retirement party had been attended by hundreds of former patients, fellow healthcare workers, and community members whose lives had been touched by her compassion and skill. But outside the medical community, her contributions remained largely unknown and unrecognized. She was exactly the kind of person whose heroism went unnoticed because it was expressed through daily service rather than dramatic gestures. The first-class ticket represented her daughter's way of saying thank you for decades of sacrifice and dedication. A gesture of recognition for someone who had given her best years to serving others while rarely treating herself to luxuries or special experiences. Sarah had initially protested that such expense was unnecessary, but her daughter had insisted that 30 years of saving lives deserved at least one flight where she would be treated with the respect and comfort she had earned. As Sarah approached the gate, she felt increasingly out of place among travelers whose designer luggage and confident demeanor marked them as regular occupants of this rarefied world. She double-checked her boarding pass multiple times, still unable to believe that she was entitled to occupy the same space as people whose photographs appeared on magazine covers and whose business decisions influenced global markets. The boarding process had already begun when Sarah joined the first-class line, her nervousness evident in the way she fumbled with her documents and glanced around uncertainly at fellow passengers who seemed to belong in ways she couldn't imagine ever achieving. She had spent 3 decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure, but the prospect of claiming her first-class seat felt more intimidating than any medical emergency she had ever faced. When Sarah reached the gate agent, her nervousness was immediately apparent to Jessica Chin, who had developed expert instincts for identifying passengers who might require additional attention or assistance. The boarding pass Sarah presented was legitimate and properly issued, but something about her demeanor suggested she wasn't a typical first-class passenger. "May I see your boarding pass and identification, please?" Jessica asked with professional courtesy, though her trained I was already cataloging details that seemed inconsistent with the usual first-class demographic. Sarah's appearance wasn't inappropriate, but it lacked the polish and confidence that characterized passengers accustomed to premium service. Sarah handed over her documents with trembling hands, her nervousness increasing under Jessica's scrutiny. "I think there might be some mistake," she said quietly. "My daughter purchased this ticket for me, but I'm not sure I belong in first class." Jessica examined the boarding pass carefully, her expression revealing growing skepticism as she processed the disconnect between Sarah's appearance and the premium seat assignment. The ticket was legitimate, but something felt wrong about the situation in ways that triggered her professional instincts about maintaining appropriate standards. "Ma'am," Jessica said, her tone shifting to the kind of polite firmness that flight attendants used when addressing problems that needed immediate resolution. "I'm going to need to verify this ticket with our reservation system. There may have been an error in the booking process." The implication was clear. Someone who looked like Sarah couldn't possibly belong in first class, and the most likely explanation was some kind of administrative mistake that needed to be corrected before it caused embarrassment for everyone involved. Behind Sarah, other first-class passengers were beginning to notice the delay, their conversations pausing as they observed what appeared to be a booking issue that was holding up the boarding process. Several checked their expensive watches with the impatience of people whose time was worth thousands of dollars per hour. "Is there a problem here?" asked Marcus Wellington, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed quickly and efficiently. "Some of us have connecting flights and important meetings that require prompt departure." Jessica turned to address him with the deferential attention that premium passengers expected. "Just a small verification issue, Mr. Wellington. I'll have it resolved momentarily." She returned her attention to Sarah, her voice dropping to a whisper that was intended to be discreet but carried undertones of condescension. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding about your seat assignment. Our first-class cabin is reserved for passengers who meet certain criteria. I'd be happy to help you find an appropriate seat in coach where you'll be more comfortable." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, its implications clear to everyone within hearing distance. Sarah was being told, as politely as possible, that she didn't belong among people of wealth and status, that her presence in first class was some kind of mistake that needed to be corrected before it disrupted the exclusive atmosphere that premium passengers paid to experience. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she realized that her daughter's generous gift was being interpreted as evidence that she had somehow attempted to access privileges she wasn't entitled to claim. The eyes of wealthy passengers were upon her, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to obvious irritation at the delay her presence was causing. "I have the boarding pass right here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she tried to maintain dignity while being publicly questioned about her right to occupy the seat her daughter had purchased. "My daughter bought this ticket for my retirement. I'm not trying to cause any trouble." But Jessica's expression remained skeptical, her professional training telling her that people who belonged in first class didn't appear uncertain about their right to be there. Everything about Sarah's demeanor suggested someone who was out of place, someone whose presence required explanation and verification. "I understand," Jessica said, her tone suggesting that she understood nothing of the sort. "But I need to confirm the payment method and ensure that this ticket wasn't obtained through some kind of error or fraudulent means. Our first-class passengers expect a certain level of exclusivity." The word exclusivity landed like a physical blow, its meaning unmistakable to everyone present. Sarah was being told that her appearance, her demeanor, her obvious discomfort with luxury automatically disqualified her from sharing space with people who deserved such privileges by virtue of their wealth and social status. Senator Hayes, whose political career had been built partly on advocating for ordinary Americans, found herself uncomfortable with the obvious discrimination taking place in front of her. But her discomfort was outweighed by her desire to avoid becoming involved in what appeared to be an awkward situation that might delay their departure. "Perhaps we could expedite this process," she suggested diplomatically. "I'm sure there's a simple explanation that can be resolved without further delay." Other passengers were becoming increasingly restless, their initial curiosity transforming into irritation as the verification process stretched on. These were people whose schedules were planned to the minute, whose presence on this flight was part of carefully coordinated travel arrangements that couldn't accommodate unexpected delays. "This is exactly why airlines need better screening procedures," muttered Dr. Rebecca Foster, whose pharmaceutical company competed with Wellington's in several therapeutic areas. "When you pay premium prices, you expect premium service, not administrative confusion that disrupts everyone's experience." Her comment drew murmurs of agreement from passengers who felt their exclusive experience was being compromised by what they perceived as inadequate attention to detail in the booking process. They had paid substantial premiums partly to avoid exactly this kind of disruption and delay. Sarah stood quietly during this discussion, her dignity intact despite the growing humiliation of being publicly questioned about her right to occupy a seat that had been legitimately purchased. She was accustomed to being underestimated based on her appearance, but she had never before experienced such public scrutiny of her worthiness to share space with people who considered themselves her betters. "Ma'am," Jessica said finally, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I contact our customer service department to verify this ticket. In the meantime, I can arrange for you to board in coach where there shouldn't be any issues with seat availability." The suggestion was presented as a helpful solution, but its real meaning was clear. Sarah was being removed from first class based on assumptions about her social status rather than any problem with her documentation. She was being told that people like her didn't belong among people like them, regardless of who had paid for her ticket or why. As Sarah prepared to accept this public rejection with whatever grace she could muster, something unexpected happened that would transform not just her travel experience, but the assumptions of everyone who had witnessed her humiliation. The cockpit door opened with a soft mechanical hiss, and Captain David Morrison stepped into the first-class cabin to conduct his routine pre-flight passenger greeting, a personal touch that distinguished premium flights from standard commercial service. At 48, Captain Morrison commanded respect not just for his rank, but for his reputation as one of the airline's most skilled and experienced pilots. Someone whose expertise had safely transported hundreds of thousands of passengers across millions of miles. His appearance in the cabin immediately drew attention from passengers who appreciated the personal acknowledgement from someone whose professional competence would determine their safety for the next 3 hours. Captain Morrison moved through the cabin with practiced ease, greeting regular passengers by name and ensuring that everyone felt appropriately welcomed aboard his aircraft. But as his gaze swept across the cabin, his attention was caught by the uncomfortable scene unfolding near the entrance, where a woman was being publicly questioned about her right to occupy her assigned seat. Something about her posture, her profile, triggered a flash of recognition that made him stop mid-conversation with Senator Hayes. He looked more carefully at the woman who was being asked to step aside, and suddenly 15 years of time collapsed like a house of cards, transporting him back to the worst night of his life and the person who had saved him from a fate that still appeared in his nightmares. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying across the cabin with a mixture of disbelief and joy that made every conversation stop immediately. "Dr. Sarah Martinez?" Sarah looked up at the sound of her name, her eyes widening with recognition as she saw the pilot uniform and then the face of someone she remembered from one of the thousands of patients who had passed through her emergency room over 3 decades of service. "David Morrison," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth despite her current embarrassment. "My goodness, you've certainly moved up in the world since I last saw you." Captain Morrison's face transformed with a smile that made him look decades younger. The professional composure he maintained for passengers replaced by the unguarded emotion of someone unexpectedly reunited with a person who had fundamentally changed his life. "Moved up," he said, walking directly toward her with complete disregard for the boarding protocols and security procedures that normally governed his interactions with passengers. "Dr. Martinez, I wouldn't be here at all if it weren't for you." The entire first-class cabin was now focused on this unexpected reunion, their earlier impatience forgotten in the face of drama that was clearly far more significant than a simple administrative error. Jessica Chin stood frozen, her assumptions about Sarah's worthiness to be in first class colliding with the obvious respect and affection being displayed by the flight's captain. Captain Morrison reached Sarah and, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, took her hands in his with the careful reverence of someone greeting a guardian angel. 15 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin, "I was brought to Chicago General after a car accident that should have killed me. Multiple internal injuries, massive blood loss. The doctors weren't sure I would make it through the night." Sarah's memory was beginning to clear, the professional distance she maintained with thousands of patients giving way to recollection of a specific case that had required everything she had learned about trauma medicine. "You were the pilot," she said softly, "the one whose car went off Lake Shore Drive during that ice storm. You coded twice in the trauma bay." 3 times, Captain Morrison corrected, his voice thick with emotion as he recalled the worst and most important night of his life. "And each time, you brought me back. You worked on me for 7 hours straight, refused to give up even when other doctors suggested that my injuries were too severe." The first-class passengers listened with growing amazement as the story unfolded, their understanding of the situation shifting dramatically as they realized they had been witnessing the humiliation of someone whose heroism had literally saved the life of the man responsible for their safety. "You told my wife that you wouldn't stop fighting for me as long as there was any chance of recovery," Captain Morrison continued, his professional composure completely abandoned in favor of raw gratitude. "You said that every person deserves someone willing to fight for their life, regardless of the odds." Jessica Chin felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had questioned the worthiness of someone whose medical expertise had saved the life of their flight captain, someone whose dedication to healing had made this flight possible. "I was just doing my job," Sarah said quietly, her natural humility making her uncomfortable with the public attention and praise. "Your job?" Captain Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only the emotion of someone whose entire life had been made possible by another person's refusal to accept defeat. "Dr. Martinez, you gave me back my life. You gave my children their father. You made it possible for me to pursue my dream of becoming a pilot." He turned to address the cabin full of passengers who had been ready to see Sarah removed from their exclusive space, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose expertise they depended upon for their safety. "This woman," he said, his words cutting through the luxury cabin like truth through pretense, "is the reason I'm alive today. She's the reason I can safely fly this aircraft and get all of you to your destinations." And you were going to throw her out of first class because she doesn't look like she belongs here. The accusation hung in the air like an indictment, forcing every passenger to confront their own assumptions about worth and merit. They had judged Sarah based on her appearance and demeanor, never considering that heroism might not announce itself with designer clothes and confident bearing. Marcus Wellington, who had complained about the delay, found himself staring at Sarah with new understanding. His pharmaceutical company existed to save lives, but he had never personally witnessed someone who had dedicated their entire career to hands-on healing. Someone whose daily work involved the kind of life-and-death decisions that he only read about in clinical trial reports. Senator Hayes, whose political career was built on advocating for ordinary Americans, realized she had just witnessed exactly the kind of everyday heroism that her speeches claimed to honor, but had done nothing to defend it when it was being attacked right in front of her. Captain Morrison wasn't finished. His gratitude had been building for 15 years, and this unexpected reunion had given him an opportunity to express recognition that was long overdue. "You know what Dr. Martinez told me during my recovery?" he asked the silent cabin. "She said that healing people was a privilege, not a burden. That every life she saved was a reminder of why she had chosen medicine as her calling." He looked directly at Jessica Chin, whose face reflected growing horror at her treatment of someone whose dedication had made their flight possible. "And you were going to put her in coach because she doesn't look wealthy enough to deserve first-class treatment?" The silence that followed Captain Morrison's question was profound and uncomfortable, heavy with the weight of recognition and shame. Every passenger in first class was forced to confront their own assumptions about worth and merit, their complicity in a system that measured value by appearance rather than character or contribution. Jessica Chin approached Sarah with visible distress, her professional training warring with her personal horror at what she had almost done. "Dr. Martinez," she said, her voice shaking with genuine remorse, "I owe you the deepest apology. I made assumptions based on things that don't matter at all. I'm so sorry." "There's no need to apologize," Sarah replied with the grace that had characterized her entire career. "You were doing what you thought was right. Sometimes we all need reminders about what really matters." But Captain Morrison wasn't willing to let the moment pass without ensuring that everyone understood the magnitude of what had almost occurred. "Actually, there is a need to apologize," he said firmly. "Dr. Martinez has spent 30 years saving lives, working double shifts, treating patients who couldn't afford to pay, dedicating her entire career to healing people regardless of their social status or ability to compensate her for her services." He gestured toward the luxury cabin surrounding them. "Every person in this cabin has benefited from the work of people like Dr. Martinez, doctors, nurses, teachers, first responders, people who choose service over profit, who dedicate their lives to making the world better rather than just making themselves wealthier." The passengers listened with growing discomfort as Captain Morrison articulated truths they rarely confronted in their insulated world of wealth and privilege. "And when one of those heroes finally gets the chance to experience a small taste of the luxury that you all take for granted," he continued, "your first instinct is to assume she doesn't belong here, that she must have made some mistake or committed some kind of fraud to access privileges that you consider your birthright." Marcus Wellington found himself genuinely moved by the recognition of his own prejudices and the realization that his assumptions about merit had been fundamentally flawed. "Captain Morrison," he said, "you're absolutely right. Dr. Martinez deserves not just first-class treatment, but our gratitude and respect." He stood and approached Sarah directly, his usual corporate confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Dr. Martinez, I want to apologize for my earlier behavior. You've spent your career saving lives while I've spent mine making money from medicine. The contribution comparison isn't even close." Senator Hayes joined him, her political instincts recognizing both the sincerity of the moment and the broader implications of what had occurred. "Dr. Martinez, people like you are exactly who I'm supposed to be serving in my role as an elected official. The fact that I sat silently while you were being humiliated is something I'll need to think about seriously." But Captain Morrison had one more gesture to make. One final way to demonstrate the respect and recognition that Sarah had earned through 3 decades of service. "Dr. Martinez," he said, "I'm going to upgrade your seating arrangement. Not to first class, you're already entitled to that, but to seat 1A, which is typically reserved for our most valued passengers." "That's really not necessary," Sarah protested, her lifelong humility making her uncomfortable with special treatment. "Actually, it is necessary," Captain Morrison replied. "For 15 years, I've wanted to find a way to properly thank you for giving me back my life. This is a small start." As the flight proceeded, something remarkable happened in the first-class cabin. The artificial barriers that normally separated wealthy passengers from human connection began to dissolve, replaced by genuine conversations about purpose, service, and the true sources of worth and dignity. Sarah found herself engaged in meaningful discussions with people who had initially dismissed her presence. Sharing stories about her medical career and learning about the ways her fellow passengers had contributed to society through their various roles and responsibilities. Marcus Wellington discovered that Sarah's insights about healthcare delivery were far more valuable than the consultant reports his company paid millions to receive. Her practical experience with patient care provided perspectives that no amount of market research could duplicate. Senator Hayes found herself taking notes on healthcare policy issues that Sarah had witnessed firsthand. Understanding that effective legislation required input from people who actually implemented services rather than just those who theorized about them. The flight became an impromptu seminar on the value of service, the importance of recognizing contribution regardless of its source, and the danger of making assumptions about worth based on superficial characteristics. Jessica Chen personally ensured that Sarah's experience exceeded every possible expectation, her earlier mistake motivating her to provide service that reflected genuine respect rather than professional obligation. But more importantly, she began to question the assumptions that had led to her initial judgment about Sarah's worthiness. As they approached their destination, Captain Morrison made an announcement that would be remembered by every passenger on the flight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've had the privilege of flying today with Dr. Sarah Martinez, who recently retired after 30 years of service as an emergency room physician at Chicago General Hospital." He paused, allowing that information to settle before continuing. "Dr. Martinez represents the kind of everyday heroism that makes our society possible. People who choose service over profit, who dedicate their lives to helping others, who work in conditions most of us couldn't imagine to provide care that we all depend upon. She deserves not just our respect, but our gratitude for the countless lives she's saved and the family she's kept together through her skill and dedication." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, coming from passengers who had been transformed by their encounter with someone whose heroism was measured not by wealth or recognition, but by decades of quiet service to others. When they landed, Sarah was greeted by representatives from the airline who wanted to formally apologize for her initial treatment and ensure that her future travel experiences would reflect the respect she had earned through her service. But more importantly, she had forged connections with fellow passengers who had been reminded of the importance of looking beyond appearances to recognize genuine worth and contribution. The story of Flight 447 became legendary within the airline industry, used as training material to teach staff about the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance or apparent social status. The incident led to policy changes that emphasized courtesy and professionalism over assumptions about passenger demographics. Sarah's retirement had begun with a reminder that heroism often goes unrecognized, that service doesn't always receive the respect it deserves, but that occasionally the universe provides moments of recognition that make decades of dedication feel worthwhile. Captain Morrison remained in contact with Sarah, their friendship renewed by the chance encounter that had allowed him to finally express gratitude that had been building for 15 years. He often spoke about her during his pre-flight announcements, reminding passengers that true heroes often sit quietly among us, unrecognized until circumstances reveal their extraordinary contributions. The first-class cabin of Flight 447 had been transformed from a space of privilege and exclusion into a reminder that worth cannot be measured by wealth, that heroism doesn't always announce itself with fanfare, and that the most important people in our lives are often those whose service we take for granted until we're forced to acknowledge their true value. Years later, when airline passengers shared stories about memorable flights, many would recall the day when a pilot's gratitude had reminded an entire cabin full of successful people that success is ultimately measured not by what we accumulate, but by how we serve others and recognize the service of those around us. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.